The Boy Who Lived by Louise Cholton. Chapter 5. In Memoriam. Harry was now gathered with the other memorial volunteers in a poky office on the second floor, where they were receiving their instructions from Percy, who was the minister's senior secretary, Kingsley's right-hand man. Under any other minister, personal stooge would be a more appropriate term, but not with Kingsley. He was nice, and fair, and cool. Harry observed that Dawlish accompanied Percy, feverishly taking notes. Their instructions were simple and clear. The volunteers were paired up and issued a schedule that rotated them between the memorials, which were currently stationed at various offices within the ministry. Once all of the names had been engraved on all of the memorials, they were to be placed at each of the different wizarding locations by portkey. Harry listened closely at this point. Percy began calling out the names of the memorial destinations, starting with Appleby, working through the others until Harry had the name that he was listening so intently for. Godric's Hollow. Harry's hand shot up as soon as Percy began to say it. He was selected by a single casual point of Percy's finger, and after Dawlish had hurriedly noted the name down, time sped by so quickly that in the blink of an eye the auction sped through from Holyhead to the final Wimborne, slowing down when it had come to Hogwarts. Several volunteers had raised their hands when Hogwarts was called, but the privilege was rightly given to McGonagall, whom Harry had been surprised to see. He had decided to go to Godric's Hollow rather than Hogwarts, and was glad of his decision, especially on seeing how many volunteers had been disappointed. As Harry was being ushered around the ministry with Dean Thomas, who was his partner for the day, by a number of different ministry officials, Harry observed that the building was much more lively, with dozens of people bustling through the corridors and mauve memos flying above their heads. The schedule had been tight, with little margin for chit-chat. Harry apologising for bumping into people was virtually the only thing that he had said all morning. After traipsing around the ministry engraving names on the memorials, he ended up back in a small, airy office that had a feeling of recently belonging to a minister of great importance but dark motives, an eerie, chilling sound buzzing within the silence. In the centre of the bare, clinical room stood a short marble-white pillar that towered over a tiny metal whistle at its base. The regal pillar had been recently engraved with a mismatched list of names. Looking down at his beaten-up watch, which had once belonged to Fabian Pruitt, Harry observed that he still had some more time, and so took a few steps forward and studied the memorial in more detail. Harry started at the top, with the neat heading of "In Memory of" in clear capitals, followed by the names of Mr. and Mrs. Westenberg, added by Kingsley. Beneath that was the gruff entries of Aberforth Dumbledore, Albus Dumbledore, Florian Fortescue, and Bathilda Bagshot. Harry's mind flicked between images of Dumbledore's broken body, crumpled and lifeless at the bottom of the astronomy tower, the kindly face of Florian Fortescue, who had given Harry free Sundays and helped with his history of magic homework all those years ago, and a snake emerging from Bathilda Bagshot's collapsed body. With a shudder, Harry continued on down the list and read names in Professor McGonagall's familiar font, recognising first and surnames that he had met at Hogwarts. As the casualties piled up, Harry's stomach sank, thinking about all the families shattered following the recent war. And after the Hogwarts victims, Percy had added some names in a flamboyant font, giving them a sort of elegance that denoted respect. Bartemius Crouch Senior, Amelia Bones, and Rufus Scrimger. Harry suspected that Percy regarded his appointment to immortalise 3 senior ministers as the greatest of honours, and smirked at the image of Percy puffing out his chest in pride. But his amusement faded when he read the slightly rough entries from Bill. He had added fellow Order of the Phoenix members Sirius Black, Emmeline Vance, and Alistair Moody. Harry had known it would be painful, seeing his godfather immortalised like that, and so had happily handed that privilege over to Bill in order to prioritise his own godson. He needed to be strong for Teddy. He smiled despite himself, glad that Bill had honoured Sirius, as few had known him better that were still alive. Beneath Bill's rough entries were those added by Dean. The wand work was rough, and he was still getting used to his new wand, purchased from a recently reopened Ollivanders, but the names were still clear: Dirk Creswell, Edward Tonks, and Lavender Brown. And after Harry's entries followed the practical lettering of Amos Diggory, who had added the names of his son Cedric and 2 former colleagues, Bertha Jorkins and Broderick Bode. Lingering only a moment on Cedric's name before shuddering at the memory of the fateful night that Voldemort had come back, Harry moved on to the final set of entries from Arthur Weasley. The first name was Fred Weasley. Not wishing to think about Fred's final smile, Harry scanned through the remainder of the names and concluded that they must have been Muggles. Harry remembered Dumbledore mentioning the death of Frank Bryce, a Muggle who had been the Riddle Gardener. Upon turning the memorial around, Harry had observed a few sketchy lines that had explained why Neville had been present. He read, "Remembering the bravery, loyalty, and selfless sacrifice of Frank and Alice Longbottom, fine aurors who served the Order of the Phoenix until the very end. They will always be in the hearts of their son, Neville, and his grandmother, Augusta." Feeling a stinging sensation behind his eyes, Harry quickly turned the memorial around again, so as not to focus on how Neville could have been the chosen one, how he could have been the one to bear a lightning scar and the fate of the wizarding world on his shoulders. But the other side of the memorial contained a chain of names, a lot of which he recognised from a picture of the original Order of the Phoenix that Alistair Moody had shown him in the dingy basement kitchen of Grimmauld Place. In an over-the-top, old-fashioned style, the names of the victims of the First Wizarding War were formed, and Harry found himself tracing some of the names with his finger as he read Benji Fenwick, who had been found in bits, Caradoc Dearborn, who had vanished completely, Dorcas Meadows, Edgar Bones, and presumably other members of his family. Then there was Fabian Pruitt. Harry's eyes flicked down to the watch on his wrist. Gideon Pruitt. Harry remembered that it had taken 5 Death Eaters to kill the brothers, who had died like heroes. James Potter, Lily Potter. Harry remembered the gravestone in Godric's Hollow, and Marlene McKinnon, followed by what looked like her whole family. The list seemed endless, but they did end, leaving a multitude of thoughts whirling around Harry's head. But they were cut short by the glow of bright blue issued from the whistle at his feet. Harry quickly picked up the portkey and grabbed hold of the stone memorial just seconds before feeling the familiar sensation of a hook being jerked behind his navel, pulling him forward into a whirlwind of colour. Harry clung tightly to the memorial with his left hand and gripped the tiny whistle firmly in his right. The short, stone pillar was heavier than Harry was expecting, and it took him all the strength he had to keep it from hitting the ground as suddenly as he had. Harry did not know what it was made out of, and felt that he would rather not find out how fragile it was. Having already drawn far too much attention to himself on entry, Harry quickly exchanged the now useless whistle in his palm for his wand, and began the ritual, starting first with using a permanent sticking charm to fix the memorial to the ground. He then hurriedly performed as many anti-muggle protection charms as he knew, most of which he had learned from Hermione during their recent Horcrux hunt, to protect the memorial. He then made a quick exit before any nearby muggles could begin to wonder what Harry may have been doing muttering to thin air. But he did not disapparate. The lure of Godric's Hollow was too strong to allow Harry to simply leave the village without first visiting his parents' grave. His feet moved automatically. Although he had never visited the village in daylight before, Harry felt a sense of familiarity as he crossed the square, passing the shops, the pub and the post office, heading towards the church, whose stained glass windows seemed less majestic without the warm glow of light illuminating them. And whilst he had never consciously considered Godric's Hollow to be his home, Harry felt a contented glow in his heart, as if he had always belonged here. In a way, he always had. This was, after all, where he was born, and where his life had changed forever on a still Halloween night all those years ago.